everybody, welcome to interpersonal communication as presented by Better Understandings of Science. Today we're going to be discussing perceiving others, specifically perception. Okay, and this is going to be part of the lecture series of interpersonal communication. So let's dig right in here. What we need to understand is that perception is going to be this process of selecting, organizing, and interpreting information from our environment. So the things that go on around us, the ways that we take all of those things in, the way that we consider those things. Perception is this process by which we make sense of the things and everyone within our environment. It's all the things that go into making, what we perceive. Although our perception seems unfiltered and objective, it's neither. Instead, we see people in ways that fit our existing beliefs. So we come to bear with these prejudgments, these prejudices, not prejudices as in this hate-filled, perception of the world. Although it could be, some people sit down with those kinds of prejudices, but prejudices has kind of become this very narrowly defined word today. Ultimately, it's prejudgments. And we all sit down with certain prejudgments, and these come from all kinds of places, specifically within our culture, demographic, all the things that go into making us who we are. Perception typically guides our communication and relationship decisions, and that is going to happen. So if we're talking about these ideological principles, these cultural principles that go into the things that make us who we are and how we perceive the world, these perceptions themselves are what help us make those decisions about ourselves and the people around us, our environment, all that. Selection is the first step of perception, and we focus our attention on certain sounds, tastes, touches, smells in our environment. So all of these things are based on those very visceral things. Since our senses are bombarded by millions of stimuli at any given moment, our brains have to figure out a way to focus that attention, and we do that through having specific prejudgments, prejudices. The degree to which particular people or aspects of their communication attract our attention is known as the salience of it, how salient they come across. Communication is salient when a person behaves in a visually or audibly stimulating manner. Communication's also going to be salient if our goals or expectations lead us to view the communication exchange as important. Communication's also, finally, it's going to be salient as well when the exchange deviates from what our expectations might be. The second step of the way that we perceive things is going to be called organization. And this is going to consist of structuring information that you've selected into coherent patterns within your own mind. During organization, the process of punctuation, it involves structuring the information you've selected into a chronological sequence that matches how you experience the order of the events that took place. Differences in punctuation can be a source of conflict within us, but a way of avoiding that perceptual misunderstanding, it's typically to try to understand how your organization and punctuation of information differ from those of other people. The last step to perception is going to be in the interpretation, and that's going to be the act of assigning meaning to information that we've selected. In order to make sense of others' communication, we compare our current perception with the knowledge that we already possess based on experiences and whatnot. In order to make sense of others' communication, we compare our current perception with the knowledge that we already possess, and our sense-making relies on the schemata, mental structures that contain information that define the characteristics of concepts, as well as how those characteristics are interrelated. So, in addition to using these schemata to interpret information from interpersonal encounters, we make attributions, creating explanations for others' comments or behaviors. There's two types of attribution. There's going to be the internal and the external. Internal attributions presume that a person's communication or behavior can be explained by internal causes, such as character or their personality. External attributions hold that a person's communication is caused by situational factors, environmental factors, rather than character or personality. The fundamental attribution error is the tendency to attribute others' behaviors to their personalities or internal causes, rather than the social environment or the forces outside that may be adding pressures to them. A related problem is the actor-observer effect, and this is the tendency for people to attribute external factors to explain their own behavior. This is particularly prevalent during an unpleasant interaction. However, the tendency to take credit for our successes by making an internal attribution is also known as the self-serving bias. The self-serving bias is typically driven by the ego protection, the process of making ourselves happier by crediting ourselves for our life successes. The self-serving bias is driven by ego protection. So make sure you remember that. We should check our attributions frequently. And you can do this by keeping in mind the fundamental attribution error, actor-observer effect, and self-serving bias, and considering external factors that may explain a person's behavior. Also, you want to make sure that you're keeping in mind that any particular behavior or response rarely stems from only external or only internal causes. Okay, it could be a variation of both. You need to understand that you can check your attributions by asking for the reasons behind their behavior. Just come right out and ask. According to the uncertainty reduction theory, a primary concern during initial interactions is reducing uncertainty about our conversational partners, and we can do this by gathering information about them to help explain and predict their communicative behaviors. Uncertainty can be reduced in several different ways. One, we might use passive strategies, and that's going to be gathering information about others by watching them without their knowledge. So, not necessarily in a creepy way. We can also use active strategies such as third-person questioning when we ask other people questions about the person we're interested in. So doing a little background digging and asking about that person from others. And last, we can use interactive strategies, direct interaction between you and that person you're interested in. These strategies can include asking questions or disclosing personal information about ourselves. The culture that you grew up in is going to influence your perception of others during any interpersonal communication. And it will be something that you will constantly have to check within yourself. You interpret others' communication in part by drawing on information from your schemata, which are filled with the beliefs, attitudes, values, and practices you've learned from your culture, from these institutions of enculturation that you have gone through. But culture also affects whether you perceive others as similar to or different from yourself. So we have to consider in-groupers as those people whom we perceive as being fundamentally similar to ourselves with respect to certain cultural beliefs, attitudes, and values. Why Republicans flock to Republicans, why Democrats flock to Democrats, why certain, and that's an oversimplification by far, but it's just a small, simple example. Alternatively, we may perceive people who are dissimilar as outgroupers, those who are on the outside, as Republicans might for Democrats and Democrats might for Republicans. And again, an oversimplification there. So in general, we like people who are like us, and consequently, we're more likely to give valued resources such as money, time, effort, attention, all these things that we consider valuable to those who are going to be presumed as in-groupers, far more than we would ever an out-grouper. So you want to focus your focus on culture. You want to perceiving the race. Race is a way that we tend to classify people based on common ancestry or descent, and it's almost entirely judged by looking at physical features. However, these physical features often come with cultural baggage. Okay, Stuart Hall calls these points sliding signifiers. These points of signification that we tend to give attributes to that may not necessarily need them, but we do it both consciously and subconsciously. So perceptual judgments often follow from our perception of a person's race, most notably the assignment of the other into an in-grouper or an out-grouper status. We may perceive the communication of in-groupers more positively than we typically do communication of people of other races, and we're more likely to make positive attributions about the behavior of in-groupers, right? And vice versa, we typically make presumptions about those who are out-groupers. We typically make stereotypes and rushes to judgment based on them. Another factor you're going to find here is going to be gender. Gender will affect perception. Historically, researchers have argued that men's and women's brains are substantially different, causing men and women to perceive interpersonal communication differently. Recent research is dismissing this completely. The ways that we perceive information are far more similar than people have ever thought. So when controlling for differential physical size of the amygdala in men versus women, research has found that men and women are far more similar, okay, as far as the amygdala. Similar findings exist in interpersonal communication research, where researchers are finding that men and women are actually more similar than different in how they interpersonally communicate. Moreover, gender socialization amplifies the idea that men and women communicate differently. Western culture typically beliefs suggest that women talk more about their feelings than men do, talk about less important issues than men, and in general they talk more than men do. However, all the recent research is suggesting that Western beliefs have more to do with perception than reality. Honestly, it also comes from us with this panoptic way of checking our own genders, the ways that we typically check, the ways that we carry ourselves and act, this social disciplining that we tend to do across genders, where if we see another man opening up, we typically say, "Suck it up, buttercup," or call them snowflakes, or what have you. And we tend to try to police that stuff. Honestly, we're no different than women, and women are no different than men in most aspects when it comes to discerning the ways that we communicate interpersonally. And finally, personality. That's going to be our own characteristic, our own way of thinking, feeling, acting. It's a factor influencing how we perceive reality. So you need to understand that there are really 5 basic dimensions that constitute personality. And a simple way that you can remember them is going to be by using the acronym OCEAN, O-C-E-A-N. Openness, contentiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. All of these things go into defining the dimensions that constitute personality. So what are they specifically? Openness is going to be this degree to which a person is willing to consider new ideas and take an interest in culture. Okay? Conscientiousness is the degree to which a person is organized and persistent in pursuing the goals. Extroversion is the degree to which a person is interested in interacting regularly with other and actively seeks out with others and actively seeks out interpersonal encounters. Agreeableness is the degree to which a person is trusting, friendly, and cooperative. And neuroticism is the degree to which a person experiences negative thoughts about oneself. Our perception of others is affected by the personality traits that we typically see within ourselves. We see in ourselves and how we evaluate these traits. We evaluate people positively or negatively in accordance with how we feel about our own traits. We typically like in others the same traits we like in ourselves, and we dislike others the same traits that we dislike within ourselves. So, I don't know if you've ever heard of the old adage, every time you point a finger, there's four more pointed back at you, which is kind of weird since the thumb is kind of like pointing, I don't know, away from you. Anyway, and there's some sense to that. There's some truth to that, in that we typically don't like things that we see within ourselves that we hate, right? We also tend to perceive our own unique traits far more favorably than unique traits of others. In effect, this is what we call self-enhancement bias. All right. We also make generalizations by presuming that because a person is high or low on a certain trait, he or she must be high or low on other traits that we consider related to the trait that we've observed. These generalizations are also known as implicit personality theories, and they're based on our personal beliefs about how traits tend to cluster together. When we use the perception process to size up other people, we form interpersonal impressions. These are mental pictures of who they are and how we feel about them. So one way that we form impressions of others is to construct a gestalt, a general global impression of a person that is either positive or negative. Okay, gestalts form rapidly. This is one reason why people consider first impressions so consequential. Okay, or typically, I don't know, and I'm not sure about the research out there, how when you go out on a date, your partner typically within the first 30 seconds of a blind date have their mind made up on whether they're going to be with you or not. So this first impression bias, this first impression thing that we typically think is so consequential. Gestalts require little mental or communicative effort. They typically just spring up based on prejudgments and things that we have built within us. Gestalts are useful in encounters where we must make quick judgments about others with only very limited information. So, I mean, it's not like you can throw the baby out with the bathwater here. There is some reasoning for it. When gestalts are formed, they are more likely to be positive than negative, whether you know that or not. And this is an effect known as positivity bias. We look for the positivity in others. And this can manifest as what we call a Pollyanna effect. And that's going to just be this predisposition toward perceiving life more optimistically. We also place emphasis on the negative information we learn about others, and this is called the pattern. This pattern is called the negativity effect. And since negativity is considered a deviation from the norm, we register negativity or negative data as revelatory or salient. Okay. The nature of our gestalt can have an effect on how we interpret subsequent information about a person. A tendency to positively interpret nearly everything and anything someone says or does because we have a positive gestalt of them is known as the halo effect. Conversely, there's also the horn effect, and that's that tendency to negatively interpret the communication and behavior of people about whom we have negative gestalts. A second way we form interpersonal impressions is by developing what are called algebraic impressions, and by carefully evaluating each new thing we learn about a person. Algebraic impressions involve comparing and assessing the positive and negative things we learn about a person in order to calculate an overall impression, and then modifying this impression as we learn new information. Algebraic impressions are often more flexible and accurate than just flat-out gestalts. Unfortunately, there's another way that we can form impressions of people, and this is something that, and that's stereotyping. And this is going to be perceptually categorizing people into specific social groups and then evaluating them based on information we have in the mental schemata related to that group. We do this both consciously and subconsciously. It's not something, and some people can't help, but it's always important to try to come to recognize these things within yourself. Something going around in the news very frequently lately is going to be the white supremacy bias. I know everybody has heard about this, and people tend to think, oh, there's no way, I'm not white supremacist, I'm not racist, I'm not any of this stuff. And outwardly, you're not, and you could probably prove that. In fact, many people who suffer from this racial bias, they tend to have that bias subconsciously, and it's something that they put in the back. So we don't tend to put a lot of stock in it, so that when people go and they point this stuff out, it starts to become this conflict, and this conflict, it starts within us, and sometimes it outwardly spills out of us in the form of all sorts of political motivations. So stereotyping is virtually impossible to avoid. It streamlines the perception process, and it's just something that we inherently latch onto. Negative effects of stereotyping that I could recommend here is going to be the ways that you can overcome that stereotyping is critically assess your beliefs. People frequently have a high degree of confidence in the legitimacy of their stereotypical impressions. And this comes from cultural reinforcement, and despite the fact that these impressions, despite that they're flawed, we still tend to stick to them, and it can be a problem. The negative effects of stereotyping, if I can recommend anything, can be overcome typically by critically assessing your beliefs about various groups, especially those you might dislike, educating yourself, do more reading about these groups to find out similarities and differences between people affiliated within these groups and yourself. And keep in mind that just because someone belongs to a certain group doesn't necessarily mean that all of the defining characteristics of that group apply to him or her. All right? And that's all I'm going to say about that. No soapboxing, no nothing. Okay? We're moving on. Empathy. What is the difference between empathy and sympathy? Okay? Sympathy is this feeling for. Empathy is the ability to feel into others. And it's going to be the ability to feel into others' thoughts and emotions specifically. And it's a valuable tool for communicating competently with others. Perspective taking is this ability to see things from someone else's vantage point without necessarily experiencing that particular person's emotions specifically. Empathic concern is becoming aware of the emotional side of another's perspective, experiencing a sense of compassion, and perhaps experiencing some of the same emotions that that person may have experienced. Empathy requires that you communicate your efforts to see things from another person's vantage point and to consider that person's emotional experience. Our empathy mindset is our belief about whether empathy is a skill that can be developed or controlled. People who view empathy as developable and controllable are capable of feeling empathy for a broad range of others. People who view empathy as uncontrollable, a natural response, they typically have more difficulty feeling empathy for others, especially when you have a challenging encounter. So, moving on, perception checking. Perception checking is going to be this five-step process for ensuring that you're perceiving others accurately and as accurately as possible. So first, you want to make sure that you check your punctuation. Practice asking others to share their point of view with you regarding the sequence of events or how they are seeing things themselves. Second, you want to check your knowledge. Never assume that you have a corner on the truth. Ask others to explain what they are speaking about. Ask them what they mean. Check perceptual influences. Consider how your culture, gender, personality, and all these things that we've spoken about, how do they go into shaping your perception of the others? Make sure that you're understanding the dichotomy of in-group versus out-group. And finally, you want to check your impressions. Okay? Realize that your gestalts may bias your perception of subsequent information you learn about a person. So, let's move on to making relationships and balancing impressions and empathy. That's going to do it for this lecture on interpersonal communication and perceiving others. If you have any questions concerning any of the material that we've discussed, please feel free to leave a comment below or feel free to email me at your earliest convenience. Other than that, I would like to thank you for tuning in, and I can't wait for the next lecture coming up soon. Thanks for watching.